Hello, everyone. In this series of videos, I give an overview of the different features offered by Intlayer. Intlayer is an internationalization solution, and more broadly, a content management system for your web and mobile applications based on JavaScript technologies. In this video, I'll assume that you already have Intlayer configured in your project, and we'll focus on dictionaries, the content declarations offered by Intlayer. For this video, I've launched a very classic setup, Vite plus React, with my content displayed inside. You'll notice that the content of my application is wrapped by the Intlayer provider, and we access certain content via the use Intlayer hook, pointing to the app dictionary. That is, the dictionary indexed by the app key. Intlayer allows the declaration of content in different formats. For example, JSON, TypeScript, TSX to add React elements, and their JavaScript equivalents. The strength of TypeScript is that it allows you to ensure the validity of the content you've previously declared. Note that dictionary is a generic but optional type. You can choose more or less flexibility depending on your needs. Let's start here with a very simple dictionary example. As content, we have an object nesting another object, containing a string, a number, a Boolean, and even an environment variable. Intlayer will automatically compile our content declaration files, whether they are in TypeScript, JSON, or other, to build the dictionaries and generate the associated types. This will make it easier for us to access our content. For example, to access our string, I simply call content.imbecatedcontent.stringcontent. And if we look here, we have hello world displayed. So far, you might say, we don't necessarily need Intlayer just to access content. And that's completely true. In fact, Intlayer provides a number of functions to display content conditionally, depending on certain situations. For example, with Intlayer, we can declare multilingual content. So if I replace all of that with our multilingual content, I'll just type this content for more flexibility and bring in T from Intlayer here. In our component, we get an error since the content isn't valid, so I'll call multilingual content. We have the content in English, and we can access it in French or Spanish, since that's what we defined earlier. With Intlayer, we can also render content conditionally based on a quantity. I'm importing quantity content and calling it here. This is no longer a React node, but a function, since it takes a quantity as an argument. And here we display some cars. Now let's see what happens if we have more than 20 cars. Well, we still see some cars displayed. The reason is that Intlayer processes each condition in order and returns the first valid one. So we'd have to restructure this object to display many cars. Also, if none of the conditions are valid, for example, with a value of 3, no content is displayed. This is normal since none of the conditions are satisfied. To prevent this, we can add a fallback with some default content, like a hyphen, and now we get the fallback displayed. We can also conditionally render content using a Boolean, with conditional content. I import conditional content and call it here. We see that this function takes a validation Boolean, like is enabled or disabled. The next function lets you insert variables into a string. Here we have hello name, and I'll add a second variable. I'm age years old. Now let's call this content insertion content. This function takes an object with two keys, name and age, as required by TypeScript. Let's see the result. We get, hello John, I'm 42 years old. One of Intlayer's strengths, as mentioned in the docs, is the ability to nest these functions within each other, a translation function in an enumeration in a condition. Let's try it. I'll take this content, call T, and specify that in English we have insertion, with the equivalent in French and Spanish. No need to change our component. Here we have the translated content with variables inserted in each language. With Intlayer, we can also nest dictionaries. For example, with nested content, I can reference another dictionary key and add a subpath like subcontent.content.number. In my component, I can call nested content the same way, and we'll see our number displayed. I might also want to retrieve the entire dictionary. To do that, I remove the second parameter and access it again with nested content.subcontent.content.number. With Intlayer, I can also declare JSX directly. Here's an example with JSX content. I import content.jsx content, and here we see our level 1 title. Similarly, Intlayer allows you to import and interpret Markdown. Let's see what that looks like. We access Markdown content, and the Markdown content appears. Now you might ask, that's great, but what if we want to convert our Markdown to HTML? For that, we can import the Markdown provider from React Intlayer or Next Intlayer, and use the render Markdown function to render the Markdown as we wish. Then, we can use libraries like Markdown to JSX to convert Markdown to JSX. If we look at the result, we see our Markdown converted to HTML with a level 1 title. The advantage of this library is that you can customize the rendering of each element, for example, rendering H1 with a specific component. The second to last feature Intlayer offers is the automatic resolution of provided functions. If I access my function content, Hello World is displayed again. This function can be synchronous or asynchronous, both work the same way. With this approach, we could even fetch data from a Git repo, or here, from an API. For example, an API returning a title, an ID, and a state. In my component, I call external content, and we'll see that Intlayer has automatically generated the type from the API for us. Finally, the last feature I find especially interesting. You can embed the content of an internal file from your codebase using the file function. I'll tell it to import the test.md file I just created with a title and some content. Then I can tell Intlayer that the file content is Markdown and display it with file content. Now our rendered Markdown appears. You might say, since we're in a TypeScript or JavaScript file, we could have just used require. And that's true, it works the same way. But file is a function based on FS, and what it enables is for the visual editor, or even the CMS, to understand that the content comes from this specific file. This allows you to interact with and rewrite that file through the CMS if modifications are made. From there, we could do the same things as with the insert function, or any other. For example, have a Markdown file per language, one for English, one for French, etc. Here, I'm pointing to the same file 3 times, but we could easily have different ones, making it perfect for translating documentation or blogs. Another useful feature, if you're used to working with Markdown files, you know you can add metadata at the top. Intlayer allows you to interpret this metadata via the .metadata element, so you get things like the title or publication date auto-suggested. Okay, so we've taken a look at the different features offered through Intlayer's content declaration files. There may be more coming in the future. If you liked this video, you know the drill. Leave a like, tell me what you think of the solution in the comments. Don't hesitate to support the project by visiting GitHub and dropping a star, and feel free to report any bugs or suggest features on the project's GitHub repository.